Okay. Okay. Trend 8, democracy on the march. That's a graph of autocracies versus democracies.
So this particular chart is controversial one, partly because it keeps on changing in directions which we may not necessarily appreciate. It is undeniable that the world is most democratic than the last decade in the world has been most democratic than at any time before. In the last few years, we have seen weakening of democracy. We have seen some countries which have turned away from democracy to dictatorship, such as, for example, Russia. There are some authoritarian tendencies even in Europe, in places like Hungary. Nonetheless, greater share of humanity lives under a democratic regime than, say, in 30 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, and so forth. And the big wave of democratization really happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and, of course, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. After that, you see, basically before then, there were more autocracies than democracies in the world. And after the fall of Soviet Union, you had all of these newly independent countries turned democratic. There was some slide back in some of them, but by and large, democracy has held in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, even in parts of Southern Europe. So there's more democracy around. And the future of democracy is by no means assured. We are seeing some very troubling signs on the horizon, but democracy is not in full flight just because Russia stopped being a moderate democracy.
Well, I would say, and even the Russians know this, despite their autocratic system, there isn't an intellectual or moral contender of any import. I mean, democracies might degenerate into dictatorships, but there isn't an ethos of authoritarianism. There isn't an ethos that's well developed intellectually, philosophically, or practically to compete with democracy. So, I mean, the Chinese can claim that their system is more efficient. It's like, well, maybe for short periods of time now and then, but seems highly unlikely. As China became more free economically, it became richer. They say, well, we can get away with not being free across the board. But I suspect that that's probably just wrong. Is that we're going to see that as a comparatively fatal flaw over the next 30 or 40 years. So, but I mean, what do you argue if you're not a liberal Democrat, in the whole broad sense, ranging from democratic socialist to ultra conservative, let's say, but within the democratic spectrum? Well, what's outside of that that's credible intellectually? An alternative system? I don't see anything.
Russia has a peculiar combination of nationalism and Russian orthodoxy. Now, that cannot be obviously exported to other countries in the world. It has no purchase on Africa, for example, or Latin America. China is an interesting example. They certainly do argue that their system is superior, but I think that the shine has been coming off the Chinese model recently with the...
Well, it got a lot more superior when it got a lot more capitalist.
It got a lot more superior. They obviously are able to generate a lot of wealth. They also have a lot more people, but they are still, on average, an average Chinese is much poorer than an average American. It's just that they are dealing with 1.4 billion people. But by letting them be freer, not perhaps politically, but economically, the Chinese economic institutions stopped being super extractive and they became more inclusive. And people could function within them and produce wealth and keep it, and nobody was coming to take it away from them, at least not with the typical regularity of a totalitarian regime. They were able to build a very prosperous country. But the shine is coming off, not only because of the way that the Chinese have lied about Corona, but also because the Chinese are involved in tremendous human rights abuses against the Uyghurs and places like that. It's very difficult for any aspiring dictator in Africa, Latin America, or Europe, for that matter, to say, China is the model, if the immediate retort is, aside from those concentration camps, how about that? Explain that.
Well, there is their support for North Korea, too, which we should never forget.
And that.
Which is a regime so rotten that it beggars the imagination. So appalling, inexcusable in every possible way.
And the final point I want to make about China is that really it is now that China will have to show the merit of its own system. Because it is one thing to replicate, railways, the building of railways and bridges and things like that. It is one thing
when you have the benefit of the technology that's already developed, and what you're doing is picking low-hanging fruit.
That's exactly right. Whereas now China has to prove that it can not only mimic, but it can actually produce new ideas, that it can innovate. And you don't have innovation in country which doesn't have freedom of speech, which doesn't have free exchange of ideas and the ability to criticize. Now, there are specific sectors where freedom of speech can be allowed. So, for example, the Soviet nuclear and rocket sciences were allowed a great deal of experimentation and internal discussions, because obviously the Soviet Union was trying to build as many nuclear rockets as it possibly could. But if you want to produce better products, better production processes, new innovations on a mass sort of societal scale, you have to have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of communication. And China doesn't have it because, of course, the corollary of the freedom of innovation is that people would be talking about ideas that the Chinese government doesn't want them to talk about.
Yeah, well, and if you're going to have a bunch of people who are talking about ideas and they're going to be really good at it, there pretty much nothing can be off limits. If you get a bunch of creative people together and they're really being creative, they have to be able to talk about anything. Otherwise, their creativity gets squelched, and it's easy to squelch the creativity in some sense. So,
and also, I think that creative types are usually people who are on a broad spectrum of autism and disagreeability, and you very often see it in Silicon Valley, but some research seems to be showing that. And these are the sorts of people who are going to not hold back. These are the sorts of people who are going to tell whatever springs to their mind. Now, if you're going to put people who are disagreeable and who speak their minds because of the particular traits of their psychology, if you're going to put all of them to jail because they call Chairman Xi an idiot, then you're going to run out of innovative people very soon.
Yeah, I'm not so much sure that the disagreeable element there is useful for creativity. There's not a lot of evidence for that, but it might be useful for implementation of creative ideas. So
when I mention disagreeability, this is very interesting. I would like to hear your view on that. When I mean disagreeability, isn't it the ability to say, screw you all, I know I'm right in my ideas, and I'm going to pursue my research wherever it's going to lead me.
Well,
isn't that important?
Well, that's what I mean by implementation, though. Like, if you look at it from a personality perspective, openness, the trait, is the one that governs creativity. And it isn't associated with agreeableness to any great degree. They're pretty orthogonal. But the issue of to what degree you need to be disagreeable to implement effectively, that's a different story. And I don't think that data are in on that yet.